In the heart of today's turbulent geopolitical landscape, a story has emerged that few would have thought possible just a few years ago. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, long seen as a commanding figure in Middle Eastern politics, has reportedly reached out to none other than Burkina Faso's young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, for assistance. This dramatic development has captured the imagination of the global community, sparking questions, disbelief, and curiosity about how and why a leader of one of Africa's most defiant and revolutionary governments would suddenly find himself courted by one of the most entrenched figures in global politics. Netanyahu's appeal to Traoré and Traoré's response has shocked the world, not only for the symbolism it represents, but for what it reveals about the shifting balance of power in the 21st century. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must first consider the context that has shaped it. Israel finds itself at the center of a storm of geopolitical challenges, from ongoing conflicts in Gaza and the West Bank to growing international isolation to a wave of protests and criticisms regarding its policies. Domestically, Netanyahu faces immense pressure from within Israel, with protests against his judicial reform shaking his grip on authority. Internationally, his government has been called out by nations across Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe. Against this backdrop, Netanyahu has made an unexpected move, reportedly reaching out to Traoré, whose leadership of Burkina Faso has become a beacon for a new African independence movement. By doing so, Netanyahu signals desperation, but also a recognition that Traoré represents a rising power whose influence extends far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré, in contrast to Netanyahu, is a leader whose rise is rooted not in decades of entrenched political maneuvering, but in the raw energy of a revolutionary movement. Coming to power in 2022, at just 34 years old, Traoré captured the imagination of millions, not only in Burkina Faso, but across the African continent and beyond. He positioned himself as a champion of African sovereignty, breaking with Western domination, rejecting the influence of France, and embracing a vision of self-determination that resonated deeply with people disillusioned by decades of external interference. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso has taken bold steps to reclaim control over its natural resources, strengthen ties with other African nations, and stand up to institutions like the IMF and World Bank. He has consistently criticized the hypocrisy of global powers that preach democracy abroad while undermining it in Africa. To see Netanyahu appeal to him is a sign of how much global dynamics have shifted in such a short span of time. The question at the heart of this unfolding drama is, why would Netanyahu beg Traoré for help? The answer lies in a combination of geopolitics, symbolism, and the desperate search for legitimacy. Netanyahu's government has faced mounting criticism from African nations, many of whom are part of the African Union bloc, that has increasingly taken strong positions in international forums. With Traoré emerging as one of the most outspoken leaders in Africa, Netanyahu likely hoped that an alliance, or at least a gesture of understanding, could soften Africa's stance toward Israel. Moreover, Traoré represents more than Burkina Faso. He has become a voice for the Sahel, for the African people demanding independence, and for the global South that sees itself as rising in defiance of old colonial hierarchies. For Netanyahu to turn to him, it is not only a political calculation, but also a tacit acknowledgement that the winds of global power are shifting toward Africa. When news emerged that Netanyahu had reached out to Traoré, many were stunned. Critics in Israel accused Netanyahu of desperation, arguing that he had undermined Israel's stature by appealing to a leader who has openly defied Western institutions and aligned himself with powers like Russia and China. Analysts in Europe pointed to the move as evidence that the West's influence in Africa is eroding faster than expected, with even Israel recognizing that it can no longer ignore the new wave of African leadership. But the most dramatic reaction came from Africa itself, where many saw this as a vindication of Traoré's vision. For decades, African leaders were treated as subordinates on the global stage, forced to beg for aid, loans, and validation. Now, the roles appear reversed. Netanyahu, one of the world's most prominent leaders, is the one asking, while Traoré is in the position to grant or deny. Traoré's response was carefully crafted, and it shook the world. Instead of offering blind support, he spoke with the same defiance and conviction that has defined his leadership. He reminded Netanyahu, and by extension the world, that Africa is not a pawn to be used in the games of powerful nations. He emphasized that the African people will not be manipulated into supporting conflicts or policies that contradict their values of independence, dignity, and justice. Reports suggest that Traoré told Netanyahu bluntly that if Israel wishes to seek Africa's support, it must first respect the rights of oppressed peoples, including the Palestinians, and abandon the hypocrisy of demanding solidarity while offering none in return. Such a response was unprecedented, as few leaders in the global South have spoken so directly to Netanyahu, and fewer still have done so from a position of moral authority, rather than fear of repercussions. The shockwaves of Traoré's reply spread across the globe. In Africa, he was hailed as a hero for refusing to compromise on principles. In the Middle East, Palestinians and their allies praised him for standing firm, while some Arab governments quietly acknowledged that he had articulated what many of them had been hesitant to say openly. In the West, his defiance was met with concern, as it highlighted the growing fracture between Africa and the traditional centers of power in Europe and North America. In Israel itself, the reaction was mixed. Some saw Netanyahu's approach to Traoré as pragmatic, while others viewed Traoré's rejection as a humiliation that underscored Israel's declining diplomatic reach. Beyond the immediate reactions, the episode revealed deeper truths about the global order. The fact that Netanyahu reached out to Traoré is proof that Africa is no longer a silent participant in international affairs, but a rising force shaping the future. Traoré's refusal to be swayed demonstrated that Africa can no longer be taken for granted. The continent's vast resources, growing population, and increasingly assertive leadership mean that it holds a critical role in the multipolar world that is emerging. Whether in energy, trade, diplomacy, or ideology, Africa is no longer the periphery. It is becoming the center of new global alignments. Traoré embodies this shift, and his interactions with leaders like Netanyahu highlight how far Africa has come in reclaiming its voice. The symbolism of this exchange also cannot be overstated. For decades, Israel has sought allies in Africa as part of its broader strategy to counterbalance Arab opposition and to build legitimacy on the global stage. But those alliances were often forged with leaders who were dependent on Western aid and who lacked the boldness to challenge global hierarchies. Traoré, however, represents a new kind of African leader, young, fearless, and committed to principles rather than convenience. By standing his ground, he not only rejected Netanyahu's overtures, but also challenged the broader system of global politics that has too often treated Africa as expendable. His response was a reminder that Africa's voice matters and that leaders from the continent can shape debates that affect the entire world. In the corridors of power, analysts are now asking, what does this mean for the future? For Netanyahu, the attempt to secure Traoré's support may be seen as a gamble that backfired, exposing his vulnerabilities at a time when his government is under immense strain. For Traoré, the episode only strengthens his standing as a global figure whose influence extends well beyond Burkina Faso. It cements his reputation as a leader unafraid to speak truth to power, whether to France, the IMF, or even to Israel. For Africa, the message is clear. The continent is rising, and its leaders can no longer be ignored or dismissed. The world has entered a new era where the balance of power is shifting away from traditional hegemonies and toward a more multipolar reality. In this reality, the Global South, and Africa in particular, plays a central role. Netanyahu's appeal to Traoré and Traoré's resounding reply symbolize this transformation in the starkest of terms. It is no longer the case that Africa must knock on the doors of global powers for recognition. Instead, it is global powers who are increasingly finding themselves knocking on Africa's doors. And in Traoré, Africa has found a voice willing to remind the world that respect, justice, and sovereignty are not negotiable. The story of Netanyahu and Traoré is not just about two leaders, it is about the changing world they represent. One, a veteran of old geopolitical strategies, seeking to navigate crises with alliances of convenience. The other, a rising revolutionary, demanding a new order based on dignity and equality. Their encounter, brief as it may be, encapsulates the global shift that is underway. It is a shift that leaves no one untouched, and one that promises to redefine how nations interact in the decades to come. For many across Africa and the world, Traoré's stand is a sign of hope, that a new era is possible, where Africa no longer stands in the shadow of others, but commands respect on its own terms.